The summer heat hung in the air, thick and golden, as I stepped out of the car and onto the grassy field where the picnic had been laid out. Around me, the familiar hum of my husband's family gathering buzzed, laughter, greetings, and the clatter of dishes being unpacked. I pasted on my best smile as I adjusted the sundress I'd chosen carefully that morning. It was bright and cheery, a mask for the subtle disquiet stirring inside me. In the center of it all stood my husband, Mark, chatting animatedly with his brothers, as if the world outside their circle didn't exist. I glanced at him, feeling the now familiar pang of loneliness despite being so close. I pushed the thought aside, scanning the crowd for a distraction, when my eyes landed on him, Peter, Mark's cousin. He was standing by the folding tables, his weathered hands deftly arranging platters of food. Though I'd met him before, something about him today felt different. Something in the way he moved, unhurried yet purposeful, or the glint in his eye when he looked up and caught me watching. Ellie, he called, his deep voice cutting through the din. You look like you're already over this circus. I laughed softly, closing the distance between us. That obvious, huh? He grinned, his smile framed by lines that told stories of a life well lived. Just a guess. Let me know if you need rescuing. The warmth in his tone lingered, and I couldn't help but notice how his gaze lingered too, just a second longer than necessary. The tension of his gaze lingered long after he turned back to the food, leaving me standing there, a curious warmth settling in my chest. I was quick to remind myself that this was Peter, Mark's older cousin, but the thought didn't dispel the flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Shaking my head, I forced myself back into the rhythm of the day, helping set up the picnic and mingling with the family as I always did. The reunion unfolded like clockwork, with generations blending together in a symphony of voices and movement. Children darted between tables, their laughter rising above the hum of adult conversations. My mother-in-law was orchestrating the event with her usual precision, waving her arms and giving orders that somehow managed to sound like polite suggestions, and yet I couldn't stop myself from stealing glances toward Peter. He seemed to exist at the periphery of the gathering, an observer more than a participant. He was polite, charming when spoken to, but there was a deliberate ease to his movements, a contrast to the chaotic energy swirling around him. It was later, as I refilled my glass at the drink station, that he appeared again. I hadn't noticed his approach until his voice, deep with a soft rasp, cut through my thoughts. Red wine, huh? Still the same taste as I remember, he said, holding up his own glass. I turned, surprised by his proximity. It's reliable, I replied, smiling. What about you? Same old Merlot, he chuckled, and the sound warmed the air between us. I stick to what works. His eyes flicked toward the gathering behind us, though I can't say the same for family reunions. The older I get, the more chaotic they seem. I laughed, feeling a thread of kinship in his words. I thought that was the charm of them. Maybe for some, he said, his gaze steady. But you look like you've had enough small talk to last a lifetime. Come on, let's get some air. Before I could reply, he gestured toward the edge of the park where a narrow path wound through the trees. Something in his tone made it feel less like a suggestion and more like an invitation. I hesitated, glancing back toward Mark, but he was engrossed in conversation with his brothers, oblivious to the world beyond their laughter. Just for a minute, Peter added, his voice low and coaxing. I promise I won't bite. The corner of his mouth quirked in a small smile, and against my better judgment, I found myself following him. The path was shaded by towering oaks, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The din of the picnic faded with each step, replaced by the quiet hum of nature. Peter walked beside me, his presence steady and unhurried. So, he said after a moment, his tone conversational, what brings you to the edges of our dysfunctional little family? I smiled at the question, though it wasn't one I'd ever considered. Mark, obviously. And I suppose the food's not bad either. He laughed, a genuine sound that felt more intimate in the quiet of the woods. Fair enough. But you don't strike me as someone who blends easily into the background. Is that so? I asked, raising an eyebrow. He nodded, his gaze steady. You're observant. It's rare in a crowd like this. Most people don't notice what's happening beyond their own conversations.
There was something disarming about the way he spoke, his words carrying a weight that made them feel deliberate. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he stopped walking and turned to face me.
I'm sorry if I'm being forward, he said, his expression softening. It's just, you seem like someone worth noticing. The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. My pulse quickened, and I felt a warmth rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. I searched his face for a sign of teasing, but there was only sincerity in his eyes. Thank you, I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. He held my gaze for a moment longer before nodding, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Come on, he said, turning back toward the path. We should probably head back before the search parties come looking. I followed him in silence, the air between us charged with an energy I couldn't name. As the clearing came into view, the distant laughter and chatter of the picnic pulled me back to reality. Peter glanced at me over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Before stepping back, the day carried on in its familiar rhythm, but the moment in the woods lingered in my mind like a secret. I found myself acutely aware of Peter's presence, catching glimpses of him across the field or hearing the low timbre of his voice in passing conversations. It wasn't until later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and the crowd began to thin, that I found myself alone with him again. The tables were being cleared, the remnants of the picnic packed away, but Peter stood by the edge of the park, his silhouette framed by the fading light. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I made my way toward him. He didn't look up until I was close, and when he did, his smile was soft and knowing, enjoying the sunset. I asked, trying to sound casual.
Something like that, he replied, his gaze lingering on mine.
The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words, and for a moment it felt as though the rest of the world had disappeared. Peter took a small step closer, and I felt the tension between us sharpen into something electric. Ellie, he began, his voice low and steady. There's something about you. His words trailed off, but the meaning in his eyes was unmistakable. My breath caught, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the pull I felt toward him, a pull that I knew I shouldn't, but couldn't ignore. The moment stretched, and I knew a line was being drawn, one that I would have to choose whether to cross. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as Peter's words hung between us like an unspoken invitation. His eyes searched mine, soft but steady, as if he were testing the fragile space between us, waiting to see if I would break it. A voice in the back of my mind urged me to step away, to laugh it off as harmless banter and rejoin the others. But I didn't. Instead, I held his gaze, feeling a spark ignite deep in my chest. I began, my voice faltering as I glanced toward the picnic tables where Mark was busy helping his mother pack up the last of the leftovers. The scene looked so distant, so disconnected from the quiet, charged moment I was sharing with Peter. Should you? Peter asked softly, tilting his head slightly. There was no teasing in his tone, only a quiet curiosity that seemed to peel back the layers of my defenses. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. My mind scrambled for something, anything, that would explain away the flutter of anticipation in my chest. But before I could speak, he shifted closer, his hand brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that left my skin tingling. I don't mean to put you on the spot, he said, his voice low and soothing, but I feel like there's something between us. Maybe I'm wrong, but he trailed off, his expression softening. Tell me I'm wrong, Ellie. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, I stood there, the air around us thick with unspoken tension. The rational part of me screamed to put an end to this, to walk away before I let myself slide any further down this slippery slope. But there was another part of me, a quieter, more desperate part, that wanted nothing more than to stay, I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what this is. Peter's lips quirked in a small, sad smile. Neither do I, he said, his hand falling back to his side, but I can't seem to ignore it. His honesty left me breathless. For so long, I had buried my own needs, convincing myself that the safe, predictable rhythm of my life was enough. But Peter had a way of seeing through the cracks, of uncovering the parts of me I'd forgotten how to acknowledge. It was both thrilling and terrifying. We should head back, I said, though my feet refused to move. They'll wonder where we've gone. Peter nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. You're right. He hesitated, his gaze flickering to my lips before meeting my eyes again. But let me say this, Ellie. Whatever this is, it's not one-sided. And if you ever want to talk, or anything else, I'm here. His words left me stunned, and before I could respond, he turned and began walking back toward the picnic. I watched him go, my heart pounding as his figure grew smaller against the warm glow of the setting sun. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I barely registered the goodbyes or the drive home with Mark. He chattered on about family gossip, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, but my thoughts were elsewhere, trapped in the memory of Peter's touch, his words, his steady gaze. That night, as Mark snored softly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed every moment of the day, dissecting every glance, every word, every breath. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and the thought both exhilarated and terrified me. The days that followed were both a blessing and a curse. I threw myself into the routine of work and home, trying to drown out the persistent hum of Peter's presence in my mind, but it was no use. Every text or phone call from Mark's family sent a jolt through me, my heart racing as I wondered if it would be him. And then one afternoon, it was, hey, text was simple, unassuming. Hey, hope you're doing well. Let me know if you're free to grab coffee sometime. No pressure. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. A dozen responses swirled in my mind, but none of them felt right. Finally, I typed a short reply. Coffee sounds nice. Let me know when and where. His response came almost immediately. How about tomorrow? There's a little cafe near the park. Noon. The next day, I found myself standing outside a charming little cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of town. My nerves were a tangled mess, and I cursed myself for agreeing to this. But the moment I stepped inside and saw Peter sitting at a corner table, his warm smile instantly put me at ease. Ellie, he said, standing as I approached. Thanks for coming. Of course, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. It's nice to get out of the house. We spent the next hour talking over steaming cups of coffee. The conversation was light at first, family updates, harmless anecdotes, but there was an underlying tension that neither of us could ignore. Every now and then, our eyes would meet, and the weight of unspoken words would hang between us. It wasn't until the coffee was gone and the conversation lulled that Peter leaned forward, his expression turning serious. I meant what I said the other day, he began, his voice soft but firm. I don't want to make things harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel this connection. I looked down at my hands, my heart pounding in my chest. Peter, this is complicated. I know, he interrupted gently, and I'm not asking for anything. I wanted you to. The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache. For the first time in years, someone had seen me, not just as Mark's wife or part of the family, but as a person. It was intoxicating. Before I could stop myself, I reached across the table, my fingers brushing his. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. Peter's eyes softened, and he gave my hand a gentle squeeze. Thank you, I whispered, my voice trembling. The world outside the cafe seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us in that small, intimate space. And in that moment, I knew I was already too far. The ride home from the cafe felt surreal, my thoughts swirling in a tempest of emotions. Peter's touch, the warmth of his hand over mine. It was impossible to ignore the impact of something so seemingly innocent. I replayed our conversation, dissecting every glance, every inflection in his voice, searching for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. Mark was on the couch when I walked in, half watching a baseball game, half scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I entered, giving me a distracted smile. "Hey, how was your day?" he asked, his tone indifferent. "Good," I replied, the word catching in my throat as guilt twisted my stomach. "Just ran some errands. Nothing exciting." He nodded, already turning his attention back to the screen. The scene was painfully familiar, the routine we'd fallen into over the years. Safe, predictable, stagnant. I stood there for a moment, watching him, before retreating to the bedroom under the pretense of organizing the closet. Behind the closed door, I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands. What was I doing? This wasn't who I was. I loved Mark, didn't I? Yet, with every passing day, the space between us seemed to grow wider, and Peter had slipped into that space like he belonged there. The next time I saw him, it wasn't planned. A few days after our coffee meeting, I stopped by the local farmer's market to pick up fresh produce for dinner. The air was alive, with the scent of ripe peaches and freshly baked bread, the chatter of vendors blending with the hum of a street musician's violin. I was examining a basket of tomatoes when I heard his voice. "Ellie?" I turned sharply, my heart skipping at the sight of him. He stood a few feet away holding a small bag of apples, his expression a mix of surprise and something warmer. "Peter," I said, trying to sound casual. "What are you doing here?" "Picking up a few things," he replied, gesturing to the stalls around us. "Didn't expect to run into you." "Same," I said, my pulse quickening as he stepped closer. The space between us felt charged, the vibrant bustle of the market fading into the background. I glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of how exposed we Would you like to walk for a bit? He asked, his voice low. "It's crowded here." For a moment I hesitated, the rational part of my mind screaming at me to make an excuse and leave. But then he smiled, a soft, almost tentative smile, and I found myself nodding. We wandered through the market, the conversation light and easy. He told me stories about his travels, painting vivid pictures of far-off places I'd only dreamed of visiting. I laughed more in that hour than I had in weeks, the sound foreign yet freeing. As we turned down a quieter street, Peter stopped in front of a small park, its wrought iron gate partially hidden by ivy. "Do you have time?" he asked, nodding toward the entrance. I glanced at my watch, knowing I should get home to start dinner, but the thought of returning to that hollow routine felt unbearable. "Sure," I said, following him inside. The park was nearly deserted, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the trees in golden streams. We found a bench near a small pond, its surface rippling with the lazy movements of koi fish. For a while we sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the city distant and muted. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease, the weight of my thoughts momentarily lifting. "You seem different," Peter said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. I turned to him, startled. "What do you mean?" He studied me for a moment, his gaze piercing yet kind. "Like you're carrying something heavy, something you don't want to share." His words struck a nerve, and I looked away, focusing on the shimmering water. "Everyone carries something," I said softly. "True," he admitted, his tone thoughtful, "but you don't have to carry it alone." The simplicity of his statement left me momentarily speechless. It was such an obvious truth, yet it was one I hadn't allowed myself to "I don't know how not to," I confessed, the words slipping out before I could stop. Peter's hand brushed against mine, his touch deliberate this time. "Maybe you start by letting someone in," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The world seemed to shrink in that moment, the rest of the park fading into the periphery. His hand lingered, the warmth of his skin sending a shiver down my spine. I turned to face him, my heart pounding as our eyes met. "Peter," I began, but the words caught in my throat. "Ellie," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to say anything. Just—" I didn't. I sat there, his hand over mine, the lines between right and wrong blurring with every passing second. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing with the memory of Peter's touch. I knew I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, but I couldn't seem to pull back. The more I tried to rationalize my feelings, the more I realized how deeply they had taken root. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and unspoken words. Peter and I didn't make plans, but we seemed to gravitate toward each other in unexpected ways. A chance meeting at the grocery store, a quick exchange at a family. Each encounter felt like a spark, fanning the flames of something neither of us could control. It was during one of these encounters, a quiet evening walk after a family barbecue, that the tension between us finally boiled over. The others had gone inside, leaving us alone on the patio. The air was warm, the scent of charcoal lingering as the sun dipped below the horizon. Peter stood beside me, his hands resting on the railing. "Do you ever wonder what might have been?" he asked, his voice low. "Sometimes," I admitted, the honesty surprising even myself. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "What about what could be?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. My breath caught as he stepped closer, his eyes searching mine for permission. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't. Instead, I leaned into the moment, into him, the weight of my desires overwhelming the whisper of doubt in the back of my mind. And then his lips were on mine, soft, tentative, but full of emotion. The kiss was electric, a release of all the tension that had been building between us. My hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer as the world around us faded away. It wasn't until we pulled apart, breathless and wide-eyed, that reality came crashing back. The line we'd crossed loomed like a shadow, but neither of us moved to step away. Instead, Peter reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "We can't ignore this," he said, his voice heavy with conviction. I nodded, my heart pounding as I realized the truth in his words. We couldn't go back. Not now, not after this. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions, each thought a battle between logic and longing. I'd always believed in the strength of boundaries I'd built around my life, boundaries meant to protect, to guide, but Peter had slipped through those cracks, awakening something in me that refused to be ignored. Mark, oblivious to the storm raging within me, went about his days with the same distracted ease, his attention divided between work, his phone, and the endless chatter of family obligations. It wasn't his fault, I told myself. The drift between us had been gradual, an accumulation of small, inconsequential moments that eventually became a chasm. But knowing that didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. It was a week later, on a late summer evening, that everything came to a head. The family had gathered again, this time at Peter's sprawling property just outside town. The house was charming, a mix of rustic wood and stone, surrounded by lush gardens that spoke of years of quiet care. The reunion was a smaller affair than usual, with only a handful of relatives present, but the air buzzed with the same lively energy. I arrived with Mark, who immediately disappeared into a discussion about home improvement projects with Peter's brother. Left to my own devices, I wandered through the garden, the low hum of conversation fading as I moved farther from the house. The scent of blooming jasmine hung in the air, mingling with the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. And then I saw him. Peter stood at the edge of the garden, near a weathered stone bench, his hands in his pockets as he gazed out at the horizon. The last rays of sunlight bathed him in a warm glow, casting long shadows that stretched toward me. He turned as I approached, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Couldn't resist the quiet either?" he asked, his voice low and familiar. I smiled, though my chest tightened at the sight of him. I needed a breather. He gestured to the bench, and I sat down, the stone cool beneath me. For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "I've been thinking about you," he said finally, his voice breaking the stillness. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "Peter," he held up a hand, cutting me off. I know this is complicated, but I can't pretend anymore, Ellie. I can't stand in the same room as you and act like you're just another face in the crowd." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. "This isn't fair," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, it's not," he agreed, his gaze steady. "But it's real, and I think you feel it too." I turned away, my hands clenched in my lap. "What are we supposed to do, Peter? This isn't something we can just pursue. There are people who would get—" "I know," he said softly, reaching out to brush his fingers against mine. The touch was gentle, tentative, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "But sometimes, Ellie, the hardest choices are the ones that matter most." I looked up at him, my resolve crumbling beneath the weight of his gaze. There was no judgment there, no demand, only understanding, and something deeper that left me breathless. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said, his voice breaking, "and I'll let this go. I'll walk away." The words caught in my throat, the weight of them pressing against my chest. I wanted to tell him no, to push him away and retreat to the safety of the life I'd built. But I couldn't, because the truth was, I did feel it. Every look, every touch, every word between us had been building to this moment, and I couldn't deny it any longer. "I do," I whispered, the admission breaking free like a dam. The air between us seemed to shift, the tension snapping like a taut thread. Peter closed the distance between us in an instant, his hands cupping my face as his lips found mine. The kiss was electric, a release of all the longing and restraint that had built between us. My hands tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer as the world around us disappeared. There was no Mark, no family, no obligations, only the two of us, lost in a moment that felt inevitable. Peter's hands moved to my waist, his touch firm yet gentle as he guided me closer. The stone bench pressed against my back, grounding me even as my mind spun with the intensity of the kiss. His lips were soft but insistent, his breath warm against my skin, as he whispered my name like a prayer. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, wanted, cherished, alive. And though I knew we were crossing a line that could never be undone, I couldn't bring myself to care. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, Peter rested his forehead against mine, his hands still cradling my face. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice low but resolute. I nodded, my chest tightening with the weight of what we'd just done. There were no answers, no easy paths forward, but in that moment, none of it mattered. As we made our way back toward the house, the faint sound of laughter and music greeted us, a reminder of the world we would have to face. But for now, we carried the memory of that kiss like a fragile flame, a spark of something that neither of us could ignore. The night ended as all nights do, but the echoes of what we'd shared lingered, a reminder of the boundary we'd crossed and the path we'd chosen to walk together, even if it led into the unknown.